When the war between Russia and Ukraine erupted in February 2022, most Americans believed the conflict would drain Moscow, unite the West, and strengthen the United States. Washington predicted that sanctions would crush Russia, isolate Vladimir Putin, and reinforce America's central role in the global order. But as the world focused on the battlefield in Europe, something far more consequential unfolded quietly in the background. China became the biggest winner of the war, without firing a single shot. And this outcome is precisely why Donald Trump wants the conflict to end, fast. When Europe cut itself off from Russian energy, Russia lost access to more than $300 billion in frozen reserves. The EU halted decades-long gas contracts, and Western companies representing nearly $240 billion in investment exited the Russian market. Russia's economy suddenly found itself cut off from the West, cornered, and desperate for new partners. That desperation pushed Moscow directly into Beijing's arms. Before the war, only 2% of Russia's export settlements were conducted in Chinese yuan. By 2024, that number skyrocketed to over 30%, marking one of the fastest currency realignments ever seen between major powers. Russian banks, banned from SWIFT, had no choice but to adopt China's financial infrastructure, including CPIS, Beijing's alternative settlement network. For China, this was a strategic jackpot. Not only did China secure a long-term energy lifeline, it secured it at heavily discounted prices. Western sanctions forced Russia to sell crude oil to China and India at prices often $20–30 per barrel lower than global benchmarks. In 2023, China imported a record 2.1 million barrels per day from Russia, up nearly 24% from pre-war levels. Cheap oil meant cheap manufacturing energy, and cheap energy meant low inflation, something America and Europe could only dream of during their worst cost-of-living crisis in decades. While U.S. inflation peaked at 9.1%, China's inflation hovered near 0%, even dipping into deflation. The war in Europe, ironically, helped stabilize China's domestic economy. At the same time, something else happened that Washington underestimated. Russian consumers started buying Chinese goods at historic levels. With European, Japanese, and American brands gone, China filled the vacuum instantly. China became Russia's largest source of cars, taking more than 50% of the market. Chinese electronics, appliances, and machinery flooded Russian shelves. Trade between the two countries hit a record $240 billion in 2023, up 40% from before the war. This wasn't simply trade growth. This was the creation of a one-sided economic dependency where Russia relies on China for everything, from smartphones to industrial equipment to payment systems. China now enjoys what economists call monopoly leverage. Russia has no other major supplier left. But the most important outcome for China wasn't oil, inflation, or exports. It was the opportunity to weaken the dominance out of the U.S. dollar. By 2024, more than 60% of Russia-China bilateral trade was settled in yuan, not dollars. Russia became the first major energy exporter to accept yuan at scale. This move emboldened other countries, especially U.S.-sanctioned states like Iran, to consider similar arrangements. In other words, the Russia-Ukraine war created the first large-scale test case of a non-USD energy system, and China owns it. While Washington spent over $175 billion supporting Ukraine, Beijing spent almost nothing and gained a loyal energy partner, a captive export market, a major geopolitical client, a real-world demonstration that the UN can function in international trade. This is why Trump wants the war to end. Not because he supports Russia, not because he opposes Ukraine, but because he sees something the Biden administration refuses to acknowledge. Every day the war continues, China gets stronger. And every day the U.S. spends billions in Ukraine, China expands its influence without paying a dime. Trump understands a fundamental rule of power politics. You don't let your strongest long-term rival become stronger because you're distracted by your weaker short-term rival. Russia is not America's future competitor. China is. Trump's strategic instinct is simple. If the U.S. wants to contain China, it must stop pushing Russia into Beijing's embrace. If the U.S. wants to weaken China, it must break the Russia-China axis. And the first step to that is ending the war in Ukraine. Because as long as the war continues, China will keep buying cheap Russian oil, keep selling high-margin goods to a sanctioned economy, keep reducing its reliance on the dollar, and keep positioning itself as the quiet victor of a conflict it never entered. Trump knows the longer this war lasts, the more the U.S. bleeds money, and the more China gains power. While Washington and Brussels debated how many billions to send to Kyiv, Beijing made one of its most important geopolitical decisions of the 21st century to let the West exhaust itself financially while China quietly rewired the global economy in its favor. And the results are now undeniable. As the United States poured over $175 billion into Ukraine and Europe, dumped more than $100 billion into energy subsidies, China spent almost nothing on the conflict, and yet emerged with more strategic leverage than any country involved in the war. The math is brutal. For every $1 America spent, China gained 3 in strategic advantage. Because the war didn't just push Russia into China's arms, it pushed dozens of countries toward Beijing's economic orbit. Energy importing nations in Asia and Africa watched Europe collapse under a 500% spike in natural gas prices. They saw the United States weaponize the dollar to freeze Russia's reserves, and they asked themselves a simple question. If Washington can freeze Russia's money, what's stopping them from freezing ours someday? This fear accelerated an already growing trend. More countries began shifting a portion of their reserves and trade settlements away from the US dollar. In 2021, only around 3% of global trade settlements were conducted in Chinese yuan. By 2024, that number climbed to nearly 6%, doubling in just 3 years. It's still small compared to the dollar's dominance, sure, but the trend matters more than the number. By the end of 2024, more than 130 countries were using China's cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, Beijing's alternative to SWIFT for at least some part of their international banking transactions. This includes major U.S. partners like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who now settle portions of their oil trade with China in yuan. And it was the Russia-Ukraine war that proved Chinese systems could work in a crisis. Russia became a real-time laboratory for global de-dollarization. Cut off from SWIFT, Moscow simply switched to Chinese banks. Cut off from dollars, it simply switched to yuan. And despite sanctions, the Russian economy contracted only 2.1% in 22, far lower than the West predicted, because China absorbed the shock. This resilience changed the perception of many governments in the global South. For decades, Washington's message was simple: without the dollar, your economy collapses. But the Russia experience quietly introduced a new possibility. Maybe it doesn't. No, the yuan isn't replacing the dollar, not even close, but the dollar's monopoly is weakening. And every percentage point China gains is a percentage point America loses. Trump understands this much deeper than most politicians. While Biden frames the war as a fight between democracy and authoritarianism, Trump views it through a cold, strategic lens. If this war strengthens China, it weakens America. And if China is the long-term threat, then this war is a distraction. Because as long as Washington keeps spending tens of billions on a conflict in Eastern Europe, China keeps redirecting its resources toward its true goals: dominating energy supply chains, building semiconductor independence, expanding naval power into the Pacific, taking control of rare earth mineral markets, accelerating Belt and Road influence, pushing the yuan deeper into global settlements, and suppressing domestic inflation so its factories can undercut American manufacturers. Here's the economic reality nobody in Washington likes to admit. Between 2022 and 2024, while Western economies battled inflation between 6% to 11%, China's consumer inflation averaged 4.3%. Why does this matter? Because inflation is a tax on national power. High inflation weakens manufacturing. Weak manufacturing weakens exports. Weak exports weaken geopolitical leverage. Meanwhile, China's factories, powered by cheap Russian oil and gas, kept their costs low and their production lines fast. In 2023, China's manufacturing output was more than 28% of global industrial production, higher than the US, Germany, Japan, and South Korea combined. A war in Europe helped China win the global economic competition, and Beijing knows it. The longer the war drags on, the more divided Europe becomes, the more exhausted American taxpayers become, and the more dependent Russia becomes. And every step of that equation shifts the global balance of power away from Washington and toward Beijing. This is why Trump often says the war never should have happened, and why he insists he can end it in 24 hours. It's not because he wants to hand Ukraine to Russia. It's because he knows that ending the war stops the flow of strategic oxygen into China's lungs. More importantly, Trump understands something Biden's administration refuses to address. Russia is not strong enough to compete with America long term, but Russia is strong enough to help China become unstoppable. A Russia isolated from the West is a Russia dependent on China. A Russia dependent on China is a Russia that strengthens China's military, economy, and bargaining position. And a China with a loyal Russia at its side is a China the U.S. cannot contain alone. If the United States wants to prevent a Beijing-centered world order, it cannot allow Russia to become China's permanent junior partner. Ending the war is not about helping Russia. It's about denying China the single greatest geopolitical gift it has received this century. And Trump knows that every month of war pushes America one step deeper into a strategic trap, one that Beijing designed, Moscow accepted, and Washington walked into. American policymakers love to say, "We're supporting Ukraine to weaken Russia." But the uncomfortable truth, the one nobody in Washington wants to say out loud, is that the war has not weakened America's greatest adversary. It has weakened America's attention, America's resources, and America's long-term strategic position. And the country benefiting most from all of this isn't Russia, it's China. For 2 years, China has watched the United States drain its treasury, divide its politics, stretch its military stockpiles thin, and exhaust the patience of the American middle class, all while Beijing builds warships faster than any country in history, stockpiles critical minerals, and tightens its grip over the world's largest manufacturing base. The United States has already sent Ukraine more ammunition than it produces in an entire year. Meanwhile, China now manufactures over 50% of the world's steel, 80% of its solar panels, 70% of lithium-ion batteries, and dominates the rare earth elements essential for fighter jets, missiles, radar systems, and electric vehicles. The longer America stays locked into a European battlefield, the more time China has to catch up, militarily, economically, and technologically. But the real danger is not time. The real danger is alignment. Because today, for the first time since World War II, the U.S. faces the possibility of a two-front geopolitical challenge, a rising China to the east and a sanctioned, angry Russia to the north. This is the scenario every American strategist fears most: China as the economic superpower, Russia as the nuclear backbone, and the dollar slowly losing its monopoly on global trade. And that triad is exactly what the Russia-Ukraine war is building. The deeper Russia sinks into China's embrace, the harder it becomes for Washington to pry them apart. Already, Russia and China conduct more than $200 billion in bilateral trade. Already, over 60% of their transactions bypass the U.S. dollar. Already, joint military patrols operate in the Pacific, deliberately challenging U.S. influence in the region. This is why Trump sees the war as a strategic trap, a trap America must escape if it wants to prevent a Beijing-centered future. Ending the war is not about appeasing Putin, it's about breaking the Russia-China axis before it becomes permanent. Because once that relationship solidifies, every future American president, Democrat or Republican, will face a world far more hostile, far more expensive, and far more difficult to shape. A weak Russia is not a threat to the United States. A Russia completely controlled by China is. If Trump ends the war, the first consequence is simple. Russia no longer needs China for survival. When Russia no longer needs China, China loses its biggest discount energy supplier. China loses its inflation buffer. China loses its dollar alternative testbed. And China loses a strategic partner that gives Beijing the confidence to challenge American power openly. Ending the war also ends the greatest gift America has ever handed to China: the ability to weaken the dollar without triggering a direct confrontation. Right now, the yuan is rising not because China is strong, but because Russia was forced into using it. If peace returns and Russia reopens economic channels with Europe, Moscow will once again diversify, reducing China's influence and slowing the erosion of dollar dominance. That alone is a victory for America. But the biggest victory is geopolitical bandwidth. Every dollar America spends in Ukraine is a dollar not spent deterring China in the Pacific. Every missile shipped to Kiev is a missile not available for Taiwan. Every political fight about Ukraine is a distraction from the true long-term challenge: technological supremacy, semiconductor dominance, AI leadership, and control of the global financial system. Trump understands that great powers don't fall because of one enemy. They fall because they focus on the wrong enemy for too long. The reason Trump wants the war to end is the same reason China wants it to continue, because this war keeps America looking west, while China rises in the east. And the longer the United States remains trapped in this pattern, bleeding money, bleeding munitions, bleeding political unity, the more Beijing can expand its ambitions with minimal resistance. Ending the war does not solve every problem. It does not instantly fix the Russia-China relationship, but it changes the strategic chessboard. It forces Russia back into a neutral position. It frees American resources. It reorients U.S. attention toward the Indo-Pacific, and it removes the single greatest advantage China has gained in decades. In the end, this story isn't about Ukraine. It isn't even about Russia. It's about the future global order. One path leads to a world split between two authoritarian giants, China with the factories and population, Russia with the energy and nuclear arsenal, working in unison to challenge America's primacy. The other path leads to a world where the U.S. stops accelerating its own decline, stops funding China's rise indirectly, and begins rebuilding the alliances and industrial power necessary to compete in the 21st century. Trump wants to end the war because he sees what many in Washington refuse to see. Every day, the war continues. China grows stronger. Every day, the war continues. The dollar grows weaker. Every day, the war continues. America loses time. Time, more than money, more than weapons, is the one resource the United States cannot waste if it wants to remain the center of the world. And that is why, above all else, Trump wants this war finished.